Hi, we continue in Genesis 21 today and complete the chapter as Abraham and Abimelech complete their covenant with a couple of surprise twists at the end of the chapter. And I'm hoping that by the time we finish this video today, the work I've invited you to do in following me through Genesis 20 and 21 will pay off as we see the tightly integrated set of scenes that you can see on the right side of the screen here, seeming at one level to be disparate and about different things, all fitting together and then setting up the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, in chapter 22 that we'll see next. So let's see what we've been doing here. We see these various scenes in these chapters, and now we're on this one here. And we got through this part last time. And as I've been noting, these at first level don't seem to fit together. The Abimelech scene seems so separate from the question of Isaac and Ishmael. But as this chiasm shows you, they're very tightly connected. And as the individual chiasm that we've been looking at last video and today, that begins and ends with the question of the land where you have resided as an alien that we saw last time, and we see the same thing here, we can also note that the larger chiasm is framed by the exact same moment, same point. So here we see it in 21:34, and there it was in chapter 20, verse 1, highlighting the inclusio, as scholars call it, the words that don't make this specifically as a chiasm, but that connect the beginning and the end and show that chapter 20 and 21 are a complete unit. And as we'll see at the end of this video, chapter 22 begins with "after these things," a phrase which many scholars have long noted connects that with the scenes that precede it. So we're looking at a very integrated set of questions, and today's issue around digging this well has everything to do with the stories of Ishmael and Isaac. So let's continue into it. And we also were looking at these key words. So today we're on the second part of the story, and we see how 7 is the key theme here. The 7 meaning Sheba, and so Beersheba meaning the well of 7 that we saw there, and of course beer and well are the same word. But then this business of the land of the Philistines, framing the chiasm, but then pointing us toward the David story, as we'll see. So let's look more closely here, and we'll see a number of elements that point us to the David story, and I'll try to explain why that is as we go. So Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and the hifal of the verb there means to set before or cause to stand, which is highlighting that he's, besides giving Abimelech sheep and oxen, here's this separate group. Why ewe lambs? In fact, that's exactly what Abimelech asked. What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs? Although the term for meaning here, henna, which we saw in verse 23, can simply mean like, what is this, or what's going on, more than seeming like an interpretive question. It's asking for meaning. But why ewe lambs? And one of the keys is one of the many connections with the David story. And so the ewe lambs are only mentioned 2 other times in the Torah, but where their key is in Nathan's parable to David in 2 Samuel 12. Let's look at that just briefly here. And we can see he's telling the story about a rich man, a poor man, a ewe lamb, and a traveler. And the poor man had one little ewe lamb, and he brought it up, and it ate from his fare and drank from his cup and lay in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. And by the time that little parable is over, David is outraged at the greedy and selfish man who takes the poor man's only ewe lamb, and then Nathan turns on and says, "You are the man." And in the David series here in Radical Bible, I'll be showing how that's the master parable for the entire decline of David in 2 Samuel. But for our purpose here, since the story of David is certainly written and published into what we know as the Bible before the Genesis story, either from exile or the post-exilic Persian era, the the audience of Genesis certainly know the David story. And so why is this particular point being made to connect it to that? Well, that point of the parable, of course, had to do with David taking Bathsheba from Uriah. And as I already pointed out in the first scene with Abraham and Abimelech, there's quite a parallel between the Abraham-Abimelech-Sarah triangle and the David-Bathsheba-Uriah triangle. As I've been noting, Megan Warner highlighted that, and we saw her parallel here, but she didn't get any detail on these. And in our current scene, she notes the conflict here, but she doesn't notice the other specific things that we're going to look at here. So I'll be pointing out more to add to that, because part of the theme that we're going to be looking at, so hope this isn't a spoiler alert, is not only the book of Genesis warning its audience against making alliances with foreign kings like Abimelech or like Pharaoh or others, like the audience was doing with the king of Persia, Cyrus, and his successors, but also recognizing that, quote, our kings, like David or Solomon, are not really any better. This is a theme that plays itself all the way out into the book of Revelation, where the empire at the time of John of Patmos' vision, Rome, is likened to ancient Babylon, the very empire that the book of Genesis is dealing with and sending them into exile. And so from Genesis to Revelation in the religion of creation, as I put it in my book, Come Out My People, we see this steady claim that it is not God's will to organize people around social hierarchies where the king is in charge and everybody else works for the king. And even more importantly, as we'll see in chapter 22 here in Genesis, the king demands a life of your sons, recalling 1 Samuel 8. And we'll get there very soon. So the ewe lambs evoke the whole story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, and the whole question of monarchy, but there's more. So we see here the little ABA chiasm here, setting apart the ewe lambs, and Abimelech's question in the center. And here's what Abraham has to say. And as Westerman notes below, before we read the verse, the 7 ewe lambs are a gift which the king must accept or deny Abraham's right to the well, which he evaded in his answer in verse 26. The gift here is a binding force that is a public legal act, although one can question whether Westerman's sense of there's a legal act of what legal framework is binding a wandering man in the wilderness and a local king. Further, we hear more recent elements. Wenham says he is giving extra animals because he wants a special concession, namely the guaranteed use of the well that he had dug. For without the right to water, a promise to be allowed to live in the land is valueless. And there's no doubt about that. As my note from myself says, the well is the first settled claim of possession of land in Canaan. And Genesis 23 will be next. But first comes the test in chapter 22. So there's no doubt that there is the immediate issue of the well and the land. We saw at the last video that Abimelech made Abraham swear that he would treat him with chesed and treat the land with chesed. And so we know the land is a real question. And the points from Wenham and Westerman and others that water is essential to life is obviously so. But wells are also symbolic. And we have 2 wells here, the well that Hagar found in the last scene and this well here. And they are connected. And we'll see how in just a moment. So Abraham says, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept, or you shall take, notice an imperative back, from my hand. And that hand recalling the angelic hand to Hagar to take Ishmael by the hand. I'm sorry, not the angelic hand, the angelic call to take Ishmael by the hand. So you shall accept from my hand, obviously he's not literally handing over ewe lamb, so it's a figure of speech, so that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. So the word for being a witness, edah, here is only here in one other time in Genesis, but it connects the other time here is the Jacob and Laban covenant that we've already seen further connections to. There's a stone of witness there. And so the Jacob and Laban covenant is one also parallel to this, but I won't look at that in detail now. When we get to chapter 31, we'll go back and see those parallels. But the one element that is key is the people who become the people of Israel making covenants with something other than God, and whether that creates compromises or not, or whether the covenant should be with God alone. But we'll get there later. So witness for me that I dug this well. And that comes out of nowhere in a sense. If we go back to the previous verses, we saw that there was the question of Abimelech's servants seizing, which is a strong word we saw, a well from Abraham. And the claim that he dug the well is certainly not suggesting he physically, an old man now of over 100 years old, has physically dug the well, but that his people have done it. And as my note below has from Javia, who a couple of videos ago I noticed was a Tongan person who's reading this from the perspective of being an island person and the relationship of water in a desert climate so different than his own on Tonga. He says, Abraham's claim to have dug the well implies that he possesses local/indigenous wisdom about the flows of the land. As an islander and a migrant, given that Abraham is identified as an alien in Genesis 21, I doubt that he possessed the needed wisdom. But he goes on further to suggest, and this is where I'm going with this, might the well represent Sarah's womb and Abraham's claim to have impregnated her rather than Abimelech? And that's what I think is the underlying story here. Because we've seen all along, since the first scene in chapter 20, that Abimelech was playing with Abraham around the question of whether Abimelech actually had sex with Sarah or not. We know that he didn't, as long as we trust the dream that God came to Abimelech and told him, it was I who kept you from touching her. But when Abimelech said to Abraham in the following scene, Why have you brought this great guilt on me? He was suggesting that, in fact, he had committed adultery with someone else's wife. And the text, as we saw in the beginning of chapter 1 in the birth scene, highlighted a poetic parallelism that indicated, if one is going this way, that it was Yahweh who created the conception directly in Sarah. And we also noted that it never said that Abraham went into Sarah or used any metaphor of sexual intercourse, nor did it say that it was his seed that created Isaac. Rather, it talks about his offspring later. So there's all kinds of evidence in the story suggesting that Abraham perhaps didn't actually father Isaac. But we know Abimelech didn't either, and so perhaps it was God alone. But what's being claimed here by Abraham is, this is my son, not yours. It's my well, but it's also my son Isaac, representing the fertility of Sarah here, just like the well in the previous scene represented the fertility of Hagar. So there's a both and here, and that should not surprise us, because going all the way back to the garden story, where we see the first water coming up from the ground, the fertility of human bodies, and especially female bodies, has been analogous to the fertility of the earth. And so the question of surviving in a desert climate requiring water is directly connected to the requirement of survival by having children. And so this covenant here is a covenant where Abimelech is accepting that Abraham is the father of Isaac, and he can go on. And this scene will echo in chapter 26 when Isaac and his wife Rebekah are spotted by Abimelech, and another question of fertility and another question of wells comes up. But that's a few chapters down the road. Now we just have to continue to finish this one. So therefore, the narrator inserts here, that place was called Beersheba, although we already saw it was named Beersheba in the Hagar scene, which leads Hosea again to note below, the narrator erases local indigenous memories about that place. The narrator takes readers to Abraham's camp and metaphorically makes the people of the land depart, pushed out again to the land of the Philistines. And that's from his perspective, in reading it, that the story is an elitist story that doesn't acknowledge the people who were there before. And there's certainly always an element of that Abraham and folks are described in this story explicitly as aliens, as not indigenous people to this place. But now it's being called that because both of them swore an oath. And that's the link I was making to the key words here, that the word for swear is basically the same word for seven and comes out as Beersheba here. So one could call it the well of oaths as much as the well of seven in general. So that completes the covenant, and we come down to the end of the chiasm with a couple of important twists. When they had made the covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech, with Phicol, the commander of his army, again noting that the only reason he seems to be here is both to fulfill the chiasm that he was mentioned in the beginning, but also to point forward to chapter 26 when he appears again. They left and returned to the land of the Philistines. And this is the first time we're hearing about this. We only saw the Philistines mentioned in 10:14, which is a table of nations, and they're only mentioned there in passing. There actually are no Philistines in the story. They're just named as one of the many peoples that existed. But now they're in the story, and earlier we'd simply heard that Abimelech was the king of the town of Gerar, and as I can point out on the map, that's right here, and this is certainly Philistine country, but he had not been named as Philistines. And the Philistines are certainly anachronistic in the time that the story is expected to take place in the 2nd millennium BCE. But when they're not anachronistic is, of course, in the time of David. How could any of the audience of Genesis, when they hear Philistines, not think immediately of Goliath? Didn't you think of Goliath the Philistine? You can tell me if you did by commenting on the YouTube page if you'd like. But certainly the audience would recognize that, because Philistines are overwhelmingly present in the story of Saul and David. And the Philistines, of course, are the reason the Israelites demand from Samuel, give us a king like the other nations, because the Philistines with their iron-wheeled chariots are too strong for them, and they don't feel like just an ordinary muster from the tribes, as took place in Judges, is sufficient against such technologically superior enemy. And so they get Saul, and they get David, and they get Solomon, etc. And the Philistines are the primary opponent throughout. And so this is again part of Genesis, highlighting that the story we're seeing unfolding here is of whether life is possible outside of empires and outside of monarchies, being faithful to God alone. And yet there is still another example of that coming up. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba. And the only other tamarisk tree in the entire Hebrew Bible is in the Saul and David story, where I'll go to these two verses so we can see them in 1 Samuel 22. Where Saul heard that David and those who were with him, and Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand. And then also in 31:13 in 1 Samuel, where the bones of Saul and Jonathan are buried under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh. And so the tamarisk tree is certainly directly associated with Saul and Jonathan and the struggle over monarchy and David's role in that. And we'll see many more connections about that as we go. So Abraham planted the tamarisk tree in Beersheba, which we'll note is not far from where Hagar was said to be. And so would he run into her there? We don't know. And called on the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God, Yahweh El Olam. This is the only place we see that other than Isaiah 40:28. Westerman suggests that the word Olam doesn't mean an otherworldly eternity opposed to time, but something like time stretching far into the distance. And that's fitting a number of other uses of Olam as just the flow of time within this world. And so our scene comes to an end here. Abraham resided as an alien, filling in the chiasm, many days in the land of the Philistines. And we really have to pause and consider that, because it said he planted the tamarisk tree in Beersheba, but he's residing as an alien in the land of the Philistines, no longer relating directly to Gerar, but in this entire land. Plainly, he's not residing in the entire land, but the point is to emphasize the land of the Philistines, which was the challenge throughout the early monarchy period. So what it seems to be is whether he's living in Beersheba and going back and forth to the land of the Philistines, or he simply planted the tamarisk tree there as a symbol and a remembrance and then was residing there. That's where he is. Notice it doesn't say Sarah's with him. She's not mentioned at all, and it doesn't mention Isaac. Abraham is presented here as alone, and he will be alone in the next scene too, which I'm not going to go into now, of course, but starts with after these things, highlighting the continuity between chapter 20 and 21 and the binding of Isaac. And so for that story that has generated probably more commentary over the centuries than any other story in the book of Genesis, we'll turn next time. See you then for that.